All right, here's a quick video for Section 1 notes for Chapter 7. Please email me if you don't understand anything. It is meant that you will pause when you need to grab the words. We might go kind of quickly through a couple of the slides. Here we go. Your focus question for Section 1 is quite simply, how did the Articles of Confederation go well? How did they go poorly? There were a couple small successes, but in general they're going to be terrible. Feel free to pause, get that written down. Here we go. All right. Under the Articles of Confederation, it was assumed that the states were going to do all the work. Each state in America considered themselves their own country. If you guys remember, outside of America and the states bordering and the countries bordering us, the word state actually means country. Germany is the state of Germany, the state of France. And those countries call their states other things like provinces or cantons or something like that. So the word state actually means country, and each state really went about their business completely separate from all the other ones. So they created their own governments. They created their own constitution. A constitution is simply a document that creates and controls a government. It's the rules for the government, not the rules for you and me, but the rules the government has to follow or the things the government can do. 11 of the 13 states wrote constitutions by time the Revolutionary War was over. And those constitutions are kind of similar to the governments we have today. A lot of them had 3 branches of government. There were systems of checks and balances built in, etc. So the states had put a lot of time and effort in deciding how their state was going to be run. But when it came to actually running the central government that was supposed to rule over those states or be above those states, they put very little time and effort into that. Each state had a central authority figure that's going to make things happen. So when Congress says we're going to collect taxes, there would be a central figure that collects those taxes. At the American government level, we call that person a president. At the state level, they're called governors. Each state was concerned that their governor would be too much like a king, so they heavily handcuffed those governors. They gave almost all the power to the legislature, which is what we call a Congress. It's the law-making body. Congress's word's scary because there were hundreds of people in Congress, but there's only one governor. So hundreds of people can kind of stop each other from doing dumb things or trying to take too much power. One person all by themselves, there's nobody to stop them. So they're afraid of governors. There's only one king. They were afraid they're going to become a king. They were not afraid of legislatures. So they gave all the power to the legislatures. Most of these states, they opened up voting to male whites. Africans weren't allowed to vote. Women were not allowed to vote. Before these state constitutions, oftentimes you had to own land as well. That was dropped by a lot of states. So more people were allowed to vote, but by far nowhere near Americans. We know it's going to take, another 200 years in some cases for those other 2 groups to be able to vote. Okay, to make sure that the citizens were protected from their own government. People are really afraid in the new country that we live in 1770s, 1780s. They were really afraid that the government was going to ruin their lives. That was why we broke away from England. Right into those constitutions, they wrote specific rights. They wrote specific things like the government can't search your house without a warrant, instead of writs of assistance like the British did. They wrote that you had to have a trial before they could throw you in jail, which is something the British, they would just throw people in jail because they didn't like them. And eventually these things get formalized into what's called a Bill of Rights. And a Bill of Rights is a specific list of things in this state that the government cannot do, and lists of things that the citizens will always be allowed to do. And Virginia had kind of the template, what everybody kind of copied after them, and it included things like freedom of speech and a right to a trial by a jury, and the right to bear arms. All that stuff was in Virginia's Bill of Rights. Later on, when we write our own Bill of Rights, we're going to steal most of Virginia's stuff. So after Virginia wrote one, the rest of the states, who were all very dedicated to protecting their citizens, followed suit. So remember, these early governments, their worst nightmare was a government that had too much power. They weren't worried about not being able to take care of their citizens. They were worried that the citizens' lives would be ruined. And this is what happens when you're in a democracy. The people in Congress have to live in your state, right? So they have to follow the rules that you're creating. Kings didn't have to follow the rules. Congresspersons do. So they're not going to make a rule that hurts them. They're not going to make a rule that's terrible for the people because they are the people. That's one of the beauties of a democracy. So, the Articles of Confederation are what we created to replace the British government. In 1776, we said, we are hereby no longer part of Great Britain, which got rid of our government. Great Britain was our government, and now they're gone. So we had to slap together something that could help us run the place. And what we slapped together was the bare bones of a government, like the kind of stuff that you throw together if you got 20 minutes and have to brainstorm. They came up with the simplest type of government, one branch, and that branch is the legislature. There was no president, there was no Supreme Court, there was just a lawmaking body. That lawmaking body had one house, and each state got one vote. That's as simple as you can get. So New York could send 20 people to Congress, but in the end, those 20 people had to decide on how they were going to vote, and they would get one vote. So the 20 people would say, the 20 of us have decided, we say yes, or the 20 of us have decided, we say no. It doesn't get much simpler than this. That's the whole government. In order to pass a law, 9 of the 13 states had to agree. We'll talk later why it didn't even really matter if they passed a law. But oftentimes it's really hard to get 75% of humans to agree on anything. And what they do agree on is really basic. They're not going to agree that the speed limit is 55, but they can't agree that there should be a speed limit, that kind of thing. So it's not going to be a very strong functioning government. Some other problems with the Articles of Confederation is that they purposely were not given a lot of jobs. They were not given a lot of power. The states were to retain the power. So the central government couldn't really force anybody to do anything. If 9 out of 13 states approved a law, and the 4 that didn't went home and just ignored it and didn't follow that law, there was nothing that could be done about it. So they kind of had to all agree. The states had to cooperate. So if the federal government needed money, the central government needed money, they had to ask for money from the states. If the central government wanted to create a new law, the states had to agree that they were going to follow that law. There was really no power at that central area. So the first thing that comes up under the Articles of Confederation is what to do with all the land out west. The 13 colonies ended officially at the Appalachian Mountains, as long as we were part of Great Britain because of the Proclamation of 1763. When the war ends and we are given this land from England, it's kind of a big question who's going to get that land. Remember, each state thinks they're a country. Countries always want more land, okay? So countries like Pennsylvania, who border a good portion of this land, well, they think this is all going to go to them. Georgia thinks this is all going to go to them. But look at New Hampshire. They don't border any of it. So what does New Hampshire get? Well, if you look over here, New Hampshire kind of claimed a bunch of stuff up here. Not New Hampshire, where they are. Sorry. Massachusetts, which doesn't touch them, claims a bunch of Michigan and part of Wisconsin. Connecticut, which doesn't touch any of it, claims part of Michigan and Illinois. They don't touch it at all, but they say, wait, look, we need something. So one of the smart things they did is they're going to actually, say, you know what, let's not fight over this stuff. Let's instead agree that the central government, the national government, will make the decision on who gets what. And then the central government, of course, is the states. The states make up that central government. They send representatives, and those representatives decide rather than, and this is what happens when you have to have a whole lot of people agree, rather than decide which state gets which, and of course, nobody's going to agree on that. Georgia wants it all, and South Carolina doesn't want them to have it all. They just agree, we'll make new states. Nobody gets anything. And we'll set up rules for each area to create their own land. So they parceled out the land, they sold it to individuals, and then when enough people move out west, we're going to let you guys become a state. So here's the really simple rules, and they make tons of sense, and it's just about the only thing they did right under the Articles of Confederation. They took all this land, which we now call the Great Lakes states, they set it up as the Northwest Ordinance. They called it the Northwest Territory because back then it was in the northwest part of the map. Nowadays it's called the Midwest because it's in the middle. But back then it was in the northwest corner. And they said, really simply, 3-step system, if you follow these rules, you can become a state. Number 1, before anybody even gets there, or before we have any citizens, we're going to put a governor in charge. We're going to have a secretary, and a secretary is not like somebody that types memos. They're a person that's going to help run the state. They're going to be in charge of appointing officials and stuff like that. And we're going to put 3 judges in there to make sure there's some type of justice. Now remember, there might only be 10 families in this whole area, but they still had 3 judges, a governor, a secretary. Then when people start moving into that state, when you get 5,000 free adult males, which is another way of saying 5,000 voters, okay? African Americans don't count, women don't count. 5,000 free adult males. I'm sorry, free African Americans actually do count. But then you can elect a legislature and start making your own rules. Until you have 5,000 free adults, Congress is in charge. Once you get 5,000 free adults, elect your own legislature, start making your own rules. Okay? Once you have 60,000, and that's a lot. That's a lot back then. Once you get 60,000 voters, you can apply to become a state. And remember, America was probably only 3 million humans, less than 1 million voters. You know, when you take out the African Americans, when you take out the women, when you take out the children, you're at about 1 million voters. So this is a pretty decent number, which is why if you look down here, Ohio, which was right on the border of the 13 colonies, is going to join in 1803 pretty quickly. But Michigan, it's going to take a long time. It's going to take till 1837, 40 years, 50 years after the Articles were signed to become a state. And that's just because of the numbers. You got to get to 60,000. And a bunch of states do get admitted. Not under the Articles. It takes a while. Articles are going to die before any states get admitted, but they use this process to get all of these new states in the Union. Okay? That was one of the only successes under the Article. I'm going to fast forward through this, so feel free to pause it and write these down. We finished the war. We made peace. We settled the territories. That's it. Everything else is a negative. The Articles had huge, huge problems. The first one was that each state got to tax whoever they wanted, and who did they decide to tax? The other states. Rather than tax their own citizens and have the citizens be mad about income taxes, they taxed imports, which is called a tariff. So anything that Pennsylvania sold in New York, that farmer from Pennsylvania had to pay a tariff tax. Anytime New York sent a good into Pennsylvania, that New York farmer had to pay a tariff tax. Well, in the long run, all these tariffs destroy trade. We don't really do tariffs much anymore, and that's because they destroy trade. Long, complicated reason, but the result was that farmers didn't have any place to sell their goods except for their local village, and that wasn't enough to keep them in business. Any manufacturing group that was making parts for anything couldn't sell it anywhere. They had a really hard time selling large crops of anything. Secondly, each state had their own money. In order to trade, you had to have the local money, the money from that state. So if you made a product in Massachusetts and you sold it in Georgia, they wouldn't buy it from you, or they'd only choose to buy it from you in Georgia money. Well, then you get back on your ship, you go back to Massachusetts, and nobody wants your Georgia money. So they had an impossible way, or there's no way possible to trade their goods across state borders. Other nations did not respect us. We didn't have an army. Each state had an army, and some of those states didn't even really have one. So other states or other countries saw us as like these kids that didn't know what we were doing. According to the Treaty of Paris, Great Britain was supposed to leave all of the forts in the Northwest Territory. They didn't. What did we do about it? Nothing. We didn't have an army. We didn't even have taxes to pay an army. We had nothing. And they just ignored us. Our old friend Spain, who helped us out in the Revolutionary War, well, we now share a border with them. The Mississippi River is our western border. The Mississippi River is their eastern border. So we said, hey, old pal, Mississippi, we got all these goods out on the Northwest Territory that we're farming. We want to get those to market. And man, crossing those Appalachian Mountains is hard. But getting to the Mississippi River is easy. So we're just going to take those goods to the Mississippi River. We're going to float them down to New Orleans. We're going to send them out to the world, and we'll make our money that way. Well, Spain said, nope, that's my river. Well, if we had an army, we could, line them up on the river, or we could force Spain to sign a treaty saying we'll share the river. We didn't, and they forbade us from using the river, which means those new farmers out west that moved out there are going to have a real hard time making enough money to keep their farming business. And our biggest problem was, not really the biggest problem, but the thing that finally destroyed the Articles of Confederation is what's called Shays' Rebellion. And I'm going to have to make another quick short video about Shays' Rebellion, and I'll send that to you shortly. But that's most of Section 1. There you go.